Millions of people fill a city square, peacefully demanding the ouster of a dictator. Eventually, the regime fractures, the leader flees, and the crowds celebrate. But a few years later, the daily reality for those citizens, the wages, the poverty, the struggle to survive, remains exactly the same. For decades, the blueprint to fix those economic realities was straightforward. You organized the working class on the factory floor, built a mass political party, captured the state apparatus, and used central planning to manage production. By the mid-20th century, however, that blueprint was falling apart. In the West, post-war welfare capitalism gave laborers a comfortable stake in the system, dissolving the appetite for a radical overthrow. Meanwhile, in the East, the centralized states that were supposed to liberate workers devolved into rigid, paranoid bureaucracies. A new generation of activists watched this twin failure unfold. They looked at the unionized worker and saw someone co-opted by consumerism. They looked at the central state and saw a machine built for surveillance and control. The desire to dismantle oppressive systems survived, but without the factory floor or the goal of seizing the government, activists overhauled their entire approach. They needed a different kind of agent to lead the charge, and a different kind of weapon. The intellectual framework for this pivot came from thinkers like Herbert Marcuse. Looking at the prosperous, complacent societies of the 1960s, he concluded that the traditional industrial worker had too much to lose. Instead, Marcuse argued, the momentum for change lived on the margins. The new agents of change would be marginalized minorities, students, and those entirely excluded from the integrated capitalist machinery. While Marcuse changed the who of the movement, philosophers Gilles Deleuze and Félix Guattari changed the how. They identified the centralized state itself, any centralized structure, as the primary engine of oppression. To see how they visualize this, picture traditional power as a massive, rigid pyramid. They called this a molar structure. The goal was no longer to conquer this pyramid. It was to create decentralized, fluid, molecular networks that could slip through the cracks and evade authority completely. They called this a rhizomatic approach, a system of flat hierarchies and spontaneous action. By definition, this meant rejecting the very idea of capturing the state or building a top-down economic program. Academia supplied the philosophical justification to abandon class warfare. But a philosophy is not a tactic. To actually threaten a government, these sprawling, leaderless networks needed a field manual. That manual came from a political scientist named Gene Sharp, who observed that no regime functions on its own. No matter heavily armed, every dictatorship, every bureaucracy relies entirely on the daily, routine cooperation of the people it governs. If that cooperation stops, the power evaporates. Sharp categorized 196 specific methods of nonviolent action, from consumer boycotts and wildcat strikes to sit-ins and mock funerals. He framed this concept as political jujitsu, using the opponent's sheer weight and reliance on order against them. When citizens deployed these methods in places like the Baltic states, they managed to paralyze the daily operations of the Soviet Empire. They proved that you didn't need to match a superpower's military arsenal to defeat it. Sharp's writings were quickly translated into dozens of languages, becoming the definitive playbook for a global generation of activists. His work offered a formidable, seemingly morally unassailable blueprint for dismantling authority. The New Left's philosophical rejection of the state finally had a technical counterpart. By adopting Sharp's specific list of 198 tactics, activists could transform an abstract desire for molecular resistance into a coordinated campaign to dissolve central authority. Fast forward to the 21st century, and we see these tactics defining massive protests, from the encampments of Occupy Wall Street to global climate strikes. Yet an intense historical irony was playing out. The protest movements were focused on dissolving central authority and avoiding rigid hierarchies. At the exact same time, the emergent neoliberal consensus was aggressively working to shrink the state, deregulate markets, and privatize the economy. Scholar Marcy Smith points out a critical blind spot in this alignment. Looking at Gene Sharp's career as a Cold War intellectual, she notes a specific limitation in his design. Sharp's work maps exactly how to disconnect the wires of a regime. But while he details how to withdraw consent, The framework remains silent on what happens to the underlying economic machinery after the wires are cut. When decentralized movements treat the act of resistance as the ultimate goal and refuse to organize formal, structural power, they create a vacuum, and that vacuum is immediately filled by the actors who are highly organized: multinational corporations, financial institutions, or reactionary political factions. Securing universal healthcare, building public housing, or transitioning a national energy grid cannot be done through a sit-in or a decentralized web of activists. Delivering those resources requires capturing, maintaining, and expanding a centralized bureaucratic structure. Civil disobedience can fracture the foundations of power, but treating protest as an end in itself without a structural economic vision merely acts as a battering ram that inadvertently builds a new master.